no mental health without planetary health. And put simply, no amount of mental health services are going to overcome escalating extreme weather events and other manifestations of overstretching our planetary boundaries. I'd like Tony Capon, Professor Tony Capon, if he can jump on. And Tony very kindly agreed to host this event, and he's very good at nurturing up new ideas and a very can-do approach. And Tony also, he's not much of he doesn't like bragging, but I reckon it's pretty cool that he was the first professor of planetary health in the world. That's a nice thing to have done, and really appreciate him hosting. Tony, if I can ask you a question before we move to our panel. The World Health Organization, there are a million topics they could have picked at the moment. Why did they pick our planet, our health, as their main topic for this year? What's the significance of that?
Yeah, well, that's right, Grant. It's every year the World Health Organization chooses a specific topic for a campaign for World Health Day. It's always, of course, celebrated on this day, on April the 7th. And recent topics have included diabetes, the role of nurses, depression, indeed. But as you say, this year, the World Health Organization has chosen our planet, our health, in the third year of this global pandemic. We could imagine that many people would expect the topic this year to be something very pandemic related, like vaccine technology, for example, a really important topic. But they've chosen planetary health because the foundations of health on Earth for all of us relate to the health of natural systems, as you said. So the climate stability, the biodiversity on Earth, the health of our ecosystems, that underpins the air we breathe, the food we eat, all of our life support systems. So it's really a tribute to the World Health Organization. They've chosen this topic. Indeed, these planetary health issues underpin even the spillover of these pathogens, and we're learning more of that with our environmental science colleagues. But today's about mental health and planetary health, this nexus, and it's wonderful. We've got this amazing panel with us today, Grant, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the discussion.
Thanks so much, Tony. And I'm going to introduce our panel members as we go. And I'm going to start off with our first panel member, Associate Professor Fiona Charlson, psychiatric epidemiologist and health service researcher, doing some great work at the Queensland Centre for Mental Health Research at the University of Queensland Mental Health in Climate Change Research Network. And it's a really cutting edge area, emerging issue she's working on. And so we're really excited to have you here, Fiona. And what might be useful is just to paint a picture for our audience. How on earth does climate change impact on mental health? It's not always immediately obvious to people. And perhaps if you could just talk about some of those links and how they affect each other.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Grant. It's a pleasure to be here. So thank you. You're right. It's not always obvious. And we are still learning as a researcher, we're still learning a lot about these interactions between our climate, how it's changing and impacts on mental health. But I guess I'll start with perhaps what is the most obvious link. And that is the link between extreme weather events, acute weather events, such as bushfires, such as floods, that impact mental health in a very direct way. We can think back to images of Black Summer, where people have lost their homes and very distressed, traumatised populations. Similarly with the floods here in Lismore and in Queensland recently. So there are those direct impacts which are fairly easy to understand. But we also have these really indirect impacts, which we are learning more about, and they're far-reaching. They are related to air pollution from bushfires, for example. It could be water and food security. So we know there's strong links between nutrition and mental health. And then we start looking at really sort of more societal things where there's the agricultural industry is impacted through drought. So there's economic loss, financial insecurity. We're looking at things like reduction of social capital in communities where they've been completely decimated by a particular event or over a long term, such as drought. So it's really far-reaching and not always obvious, and there's a lot of research going on to understand that more.
Thanks, Fiona. I mean, that's really clear when you look at all those different pathways, and it is an emerging area. We also hear people talk more commonly about this idea of climate anxiety. Could you tell us a bit about that, particularly with your psychiatric background? What's going on, and what is this? What do we mean by climate anxiety?
Yeah, thanks, Grant. It's probably something that I think most people have heard this term by now, but it's fairly recent. It's come up and is being used more and more in recent years. And it's generally described, or it was sort of founded as a way of describing this fear and worry and distress and anxiety-like symptoms to impending doom was actually the words used in the original definition. Whether it, what it actually looks like in a sort of defined or even a clinical way is not well understood. I've got a PhD student who's exploring this at the moment. It's important, I think, to understand that fear and worry as a response to climate change and its impact is quite a normal emotional response. So we don't always want to pathologize these emotional responses, but we know that in a children's survey in over 10 countries, for example, over 60% of the participants reported being very worried or extremely worried about climate change. So the risk here is that it becomes overwhelming for people and it impacts their functioning in quite a maladaptive way. So that's probably our concern, and there is research going into that as to whether climate anxiety is its own thing or whether it's more of a traditional anxiety response, and also trying to find out how we help people through that.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I work as a GP as well, and you definitely see some young people particularly, but anyone who are really quite obsessed with this issue and very energized and worried about the climate.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, particularly our young people.
So the other thing I wanted to ask you is, it has been said that, in a way, Australia's the poster child for the negative impacts of climate change. We're a very dry continent. And, some of the climate scientists are saying Australia's really already getting hit pretty hard. If we take the example of heat and heat waves and a very clear divergence from what you'd expect from average temperatures, are you able to comment on that, particularly like how is this playing out on people's mental health?
Yeah, look, heat, I think, I don't think we know is a particular concern in Australia. The latest IPCC report and the regional report for Australasia has flagged that heat is a particular vulnerability for Australia. We're already at 1.4 degrees. And we know from the research already, even though we've sort of in, as you mentioned, early stages of research in mental health and climate change, we know that it's impacting mental health in several ways. We're seeing increased mental health related emergency department presentations, hospital admissions. It's been associated with increased self-harm and suicide. It's also been associated with sort of even just emotional responses such as increased irritability, anger, panic. We see impacts on people who are already living with mental illness, generally the more severe mental disorders such as psychotic disorders, due to impacts or interactions of heat with the medications that they are taking. We are seeing increased vulnerability to brain toxicity with substance use. So it's really quite broad and quite impactful. People are proposing that heat is the #1 concern for mental health, above and beyond other potential exposures.
Well, thanks so much, Fiona. That's a great sketch of what's going on, and really excited to see your centre and the work that you're doing there. We'll come back to you in our panel, and I'm going to move to our next panelist, Professor Jane Fisher, Monash University, Director of Global and Women's Health, Head and Co-Director of Planetary Health Division at the School of Public Health and Preventive Medicine. And having a look at Jane's work, I could see some fantastic research about social determinants of mental health, you know, gender-based risks to mental health. And I also noticed that very early on during the COVID pandemic that Jane led some of the early research on the mental health impacts of COVID. So highly relevant to a number of planetary health issues. Have we got Jane online there on the video?
I think so. And
yes, there you are.
Thank you very much indeed for this invitation. And thank you to Fiona for setting the scene so well. So as we've been reminded, World Health Day marks the anniversary of the founding of the World Health Organization. So I'd like to start by reminding us of what WHO defines mental health as being. It reminds us that it's a state of well-being in which everyone can realise their abilities, cope with the normal stresses of life, work productively, and contribute to the community. So it's much more than the absence of illness. So drawing on this definition today, I wanted to talk to you about 3 things that I think are relevant to our consideration of really the fundamental importance of planetary health to human health, especially mental health. The first, and I think Fiona has alluded to this, is our conceptual framework. Most efforts so far have focused on understanding mental health problems in the context of environmental hazards, but we know much less about what it is for normal or average mental health and how this might be affected and how we might conceptualise it. At the moment, most of our research evidence is about depression and anxiety and psychological stress, as we've been hearing, and of how these are elevated following environmental disasters or extreme weather events. But most people don't want these labels applied to them, and they don't view their psychological distress as pathological or sick. They see it as related to their circumstances. So I think we need to begin expanding our conceptual framework to include things like demoralization, which is a psychological state that occurs in situations where people feel unable to respond to their circumstances. So while it captures feelings of distress or sadness, mostly it's characterized by a sense of subjective incompetence and helplessness in the face of extremely stressful circumstances. Being dispirited or disheartened are also common experiences where people lose their enthusiasm or excitement in life because their situations are intractably difficult. It's also crucial that we think about what normal human responses are to these abnormal circumstances. The impact of trauma when a person either feels helpless and horror and as though they are at risk of dying or severe injury, or they're witnessing these things happening to others. And these can really change psychological functioning. So people feel paralysed or frozen, intensely fearful when exposed to similar situations, or preoccupied by intrusive thoughts and images of what's happened to them. Grief is a very normal and familiar psychological process that follows bereavement or major loss. When grief is experienced after a publicly recognised loss, like a death of a family member, it elicits increased support, and it's usually accompanied by rituals or ceremonies. But disenfranchised grief is the term applied to experiences of loss that are not recognised, either by the person or by others. Things like losing your livelihood, losing your home and possessions, losing your health, your autonomy, or your hope for the future. And these too lead to psychological changes of sadness, uncertainty, yearning for reality to be different. But they tend not to attract the support that recognised grief attracts. There are common causal mechanisms to all of these experiences, and essentially these are experiences of feeling trapped or confined or powerless in a situation, coupled with a sense of humiliation. But what they have in common is that they're associated with changes in how we think and how we behave. So people having these experiences have lower volition and drive. They're less creative. They're less able to think with clarity or problem solve. Emotion regulation is worse. Irritability and anger are higher. People are less socially engaged, less trusting, and less optimistic. And of course, these are burdensome experiences for individuals, but collectively, they diminish our capacity to address the problems that humanity is experiencing. So my second point is what we know about the impact of problems with the health of the planet for population mental health. And I think it's notable that a lot of this evidence is generated in Australia. We've just heard about the impact of drought, of chronic, lasting environmental changes. And of course, this is especially problematic for people working in and reliant on agriculture. We know that farmers whose property is affected by drought, particularly protracted drought, experience profound, often silent, unexpressed despair. It can be complicated because they often feel abandoned by government and society in their predicament. They can feel a very high sense of responsibility for their families, both of origin and their spouse and children, with shame and powerlessness about their inability to change the circumstance. Often people say it's difficult to believe anyone can assist them. They don't confide in others. They can misuse alcohol. And we know this is a risk for suicide, which can be seen as the only solution. We're conscious, of course, all of us at the moment, of the impact of acute events, of fires, floods, and in other parts of the world, tsunamis, hurricanes, and earthquakes. And these induce intense fear for lives and livelihoods, and for the impact of loss of loved ones, pets, households, stock or possessions and equipment. The dependence that this forces people into on other people for food, clothing, and basic necessities really compounds humiliation and shame. There's great uncertainty about the present and the future, and these lead to the stress reactions that we've heard about, and grief and disenfranchised grief, many for the losses associated with what they think is a permanent change in their lives. Anger problems are prevalent, and we know that there's increased violence, especially family violence, after these events. So my final point is, what does this cause us to consider on World Health Day? So if we return to WHO's definition, I think our capacity to achieve a state of well-being is constrained by environmental hazards. Our ability to cope with the normal stresses of life needs to be recalibrated to understand what normal stresses are in this context, and how we develop individual and community capacities in what is a new and, I think, more difficult normal. Our ability to work productively and fruitfully is really altered because many forms of work are more difficult or no longer available. Our capacity to contribute to the community is changed when our communities are chronically affected and permanently changed. To me, the hallmarks of understanding the impact of planetary health on mental health is that everyone is affected. We have to consider the heightened psychological needs of the whole population, not just those who are especially vulnerable because of their social circumstances or existing health problems. We have to really consider carefully whether pathologizing descriptors and the language of mental illness serve us well in this circumstance. I think we have to extend our conceptual frameworks to think about what is normal mental health in the abnormal context of pervasive and threatening environmental change. Of course, mitigation of environmental change is going to be the most helpful thing, but that's not a rapid solution. So what does help is maximising a sense of agency, assisting people to strengthen their connections within communities and to understand what community resilience is in their context, and also to extend our capacity to understand respectful recognition of the coincidental burdens of social and environmental adversity. So I think we need active, imaginative, accessible, co-designed prevention and mental health promotion strategies, as well as treatment. And these are, of course, a collective challenge that extends well beyond the health sector. So there is clearly no planetary health without mental health. But I think most importantly, there's no mental health without planetary health. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jane. And we really appreciate these two very thoughtful perspectives. If I could have a brief follow-up question after your very interesting presentation. And don't forget, everyone, the Q&A is open now, so you can start to, pop any questions in there that we'll get to after our third panelist. So my question is around this issue that you've raised around conceptualization. And, often as someone working at Beyond Blue, this question comes up, to what extent are we over-medicalizing or pathologizing distress? And I wonder if you could just comment a bit more on that, this sort of the pathological descriptors, and they might not be serving us well. I think you said, I'm really interested in that.
So thank you so much for the question. This is a matter close to my heart. I think we are all conscious of stigma, and that the use of pathologizing labels constitutes a barrier to naming, disclosing, talking about these experiences. But I actually think the environmental changes are so pervasive, we have to begin thinking in whole of population terms. And this means really reconsidering what is normal. How is this changed by these experiences? And so I think adding to our conceptual frameworks and not relying on those that have traditionally categorized people as sick or well is the challenge for our disciplines. And that this is really an area where widespread community consultation is so important, so that we don't just bring our perspectives as healthcare providers or health researchers. We really seek to understand that from the perspectives of people with lived experience. So I don't have the answer yet, but I do think it's something we should collectively continue to engage in.
Thank you very much, Jane. And we'll now move to our third panelist, and we will get to some Q&A questions afterwards. And I'm delighted to introduce Associate Professor Melissa Caston from the Caston Centre for Human Rights Law at Monash University. And among a number of books that she's edited, one very relevant one today is Critical Perspective on Human Rights Law in Australia. So, as Jane said, this is an issue that goes well beyond a single discipline. And, it is about broader community resilience, engaging with business, engaging across the society. And we're really honoured to have Melissa here to find out a bit more about what the law has to say about these environmental issues. And Melissa, I am aware as a non-lawyer that last year in October, the United Nations passed a resolution recognising access to a healthy and sustainable environment as a universal right. Now, sounds very noble to me, but I have no idea what that actually means. And so we'd really appreciate if you could enlighten us a little bit about what such a law actually means.
Well, thank you, Grant, and thank you, Tony, as well, for inviting me to this panel. And I'd like to acknowledge the previous speakers who informed our thinking about these issues so comprehensively. Well, Grant, I guess what I'd say to you is, you know, these issues that we've talked about today already, and all of our audience here today and all of us who are working in this area really understand that something systemic has to change in order to address the complexities and the wide-ranging kind of interdependencies that are involved here. And one of the theories of change that I sort of think is instrumental here is that we need to use law to address these issues at a very deep level and a very pervasive level across a number of different social and economic areas. So one of the areas of law that's really useful, I think, for this kind of advocacy for change is using the international law, and particularly the international law of human rights, because for a long time there's an established, very foundational idea that everyone has the right to enjoy the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. And we describe that in very shorthand as the right to health. But there's actually 50 years of courts and expert commentary on what the right to health means. And of course, it's not just your physical existence, but also your mental capacity and resilience and abilities as well. And that has now really over the last 30 years, but in the immediate sense, most recently, dovetailed into a concept of the right to a healthy environment, because we can't really have a highest attainable standard of physical and mental health unless we have a healthy environment in which to exist in and to live our lives and to do our best and to achieve all the things that we want to participate in. Now, that recognition of a right to a healthy environment has really been decades in the making. There's very early UN conferences and meetings and expert work that's been done on the importance of the environment and its impacts on humans and humans' impact on the environment. And many of the people in the MSDI context will be aware that the United Nations General Assembly passed a United Nations Millennium Declaration in 2000, and that emphasised very clearly the relationship and the connection between human development, sustainable development, and human rights. And even the Paris Agreement on climate change in 2015 drew the explicit link between human rights and climate change, even including the human rights of Indigenous people, who of course have particular needs in this area. So there's been a really strong trajectory of understanding and explicit recognition of the relationship between planetary health and health of people, and that will obviously include the mental health side of it. So most recently, this is my long way around to answer your question, Grant, the Human Rights Council, which is one of the key human rights bodies in the UN, expressed very grave concern about the impact of climate change and the adverse impacts that was having on full enjoyment of human rights, and called on nation states to take really concerted action. And that culminated last year in 2021 with this recognition of a human right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. So that's really at that UN level, and the impact that that has for us is that it means that nation states all need to adopt policies to promote the enjoyment of that human right and to take account of all their obligations to human rights and the relationship with the environment in all the implementation of all domestic development policies, including, you know, the granting of mining licenses, or the making of pollution laws, or the strengthening of regulatory settings. So in all the nation states are now obliged I mean, they were before anyway, I think on a moral level, but now at a legal level, they're obliged as nations of the world to endeavour and adopt policies that promote and protect this aspect of human rights law. So I think this is really important step forward because it gives us another lever to push with governments, with lawmakers, with policy decision makers, the right kind of steps that lead to promotion and protection of a healthy environment. So I don't know if I've answered your question to the non-lawyer, but I hope I have.
So question, Melissa. I mean, again, I see it as a sign of hope that at least in the international legal setting, there is such laws being put in place. But does that mean that people who are concerned about environmental issues will at some point be able to go and take to task Australian government about various issues? I mean, is that what it means, or how does it play out in a domestic setting?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Grant, because you've asked me about constitutional law and international law, and you know that I could talk for about 90 minutes at a time on this topic. So you're really pushing me to keep this condensed to a very narrow answer. But the short answer is that international law and its standards do not automatically become part of Australian law. So Australia as a nation can go outside on the international stage and make all sorts of arrangements and agreements and assurances to our colleagues on the international stage. That won't sink into Australian law unless the parliaments do something to implement those promises and assurances and commitments internally. And when some international law and human rights law does get implemented internally, and some hasn't been so far, and some we should be advocating for our governments at state level and federal level to adhere to the commitments and the obligations that we have in the international world. So it doesn't really mean that the UN is going to come in with the blue hats and start implementing climate change compliance policies in Australia. That's not the way international law works, at least not in this country. But it does give us a very important lever or angle to increase the motivation and the advocacy for the domestic implementation of these standards, which we all know from our work, from the international committees, from the science, from our own experience even, we all know is now necessary, that we're here. We can't keep waiting for something else to happen, but governments will have to implement law in order to address these issues at that whole of system level.
So, on that point, I mean, in Australia, well, recently we've seen this new IPCC report coming out, more or less saying, last chance, guys, please do something. And, by the way, Australia's in the crosshairs. And yet, with that naive, non-lawyer enthusiasm, I saw these young teenagers take the minister to court, the Sharma case recently. And I thought, common sense has prevailed. They've had to recognise their right to future generations. But then I gather the federal court overturned the Sharma climate case. Would you mind enlightening us, first of all, a little bit explaining what the case actually was and what it means that it's been overturned?
Okay, so what I was talking about just before, Grant, was the ability of governments to make laws and parliamentarians and lawmakers to do the things that are needed to be done at a systematic level. And that would be my first thing would be, let's change these laws that are needed in order to achieve the outcomes that we know science and everyone else is telling us are necessary. Sometimes when laws are not changed in a timely manner and the law has not kept up with the social or the economic or the other contexts, people use litigation as a way of achieving a change to the law rather than waiting for the politicians to change the law. And we've seen that very commonly in cases in the Netherlands and in other international countries. There's been these kind of cases where people have litigated to try and get recognition of the relationship between the government's obligations and the people in a country. And so this case of Sharma was a case where some young people living in Australia brought a legal action against the Commonwealth Minister for the Environment because the minister approved the extension of a coal mine. And the effect of the extension of the coal mine would be to increase coal extraction, and that brings with it consequential environmental impacts, which we also consider are attributable and lead to consequences of climate change. So really the principle that these young people were bringing before the court was like the case that people might be familiar with that's called Donahue and Stephen, the one about the snail in the bottle. And really that's an old principle called tort, or it's a negligence principle. And really that means that a person or a government or a company, a legal person, must take reasonable steps to avoid acts or omissions that you can reasonably foresee will damage a person. So if there's a relationship between the acts that you do and the damage that's caused to me, you have a duty to make sure you don't do those actions that will cause damage to me. Now, the judge in the first instance in this case, the first level of the federal court, found that the extension of the coal mine that the Commonwealth Minister approved of would increase the risk of harm to these young people. And it was reasonably foreseeable that the children would be exposed to real consequences brought about by climate change. But when that case was appealed by the Commonwealth Minister up to the next level of the federal court judges thought that the first judge had extended that principle of negligence, that relationship between the duty on one hand and the foreseeability on the other hand, that had been extended too far. So it had stretched the legal principle a bit too far. Mind you, all the federal court judges acknowledged that the risk posed by climate change was acute and real and demonstrated as a matter of evidence. So the courts all did recognise the climate change imperative. What they resisted as from a matter of a legal argument was the stretching of the principle from the snail in the bottle, I guess, to the minister's duty and the children. So it's through the legal lens of that negligence principle where the case got overturned. But cases like this have been run in a number of different countries around the world, and the principles of negligence have applied. So I think we're going to see more legal action in this space, whilst governments are not taking in hand the real obligation to change at the systemic level our responses to these threats.
Thanks, Melissa. That's crystal clear, which is saying something to me, because sometimes legal stuff is hard to follow, but that's really enlightening, I think, for our audience. What I'd like to do now is with a question that I'd like to put to our three panelists, since Melissa's been talking about these young people who, really felt there was nothing else they could do. We know our young people, the Mission Australia report of last year tells us that our young people are very distressed about environmental issues, about climate change. I think their top two issues last year were climate change and COVID, not surprising. So my question is, from the perspective of your various disciplines, what's going on with our young people and their concerns about climate change? And why has it come to a point where they feel they've got to take the Commonwealth Minister for the Environment to court because nobody's listening to them? And maybe Jane, since you're nodding so nice, I'm going to put you on the spot first, if I might.
Look, I think we know that worry, anxiety, whatever label we use for it, is highest when you have very little agency. And I think this is why it's especially of concern to young people, because they're not yet in a life situation where they can exert much agency over their own lives, let alone over the public good. And so I interpret it as a sense of powerlessness that is really reflects their life stage. And so I think it's very crucial that we take every opportunity to increase their sense of agency and influence by seeking their views, their opinions, by thinking with them of ways in which they can exert change. And I see this court case as having really exemplified that they were seeking to act with agency over their own futures and the futures of their peers. So that would be my understanding of why it is of such concern to them and why we have an obligation to respond effectively and helpfully.
Thanks, Jane. And perhaps Fiona, if I can turn to you, with your knowledge about the mental health impacts of climate change, can you comment on what's going on with our young people and why they are feeling, how they're feeling and their concerns?
Yeah, look, I'm not sure that there's any clear, definitive answer, but I definitely agree with Jane's assessment. I think a lot of it, the kids aren't old enough to vote. They have no political influence. There's no systems in place for them to really create change. So I think Jane's assessment is right. I think a lot of it is that sense of powerlessness, and but also they are the generation that are going to feel this the most, and they know that, they're acutely aware of it. Also reflecting, again, sort of reinforcing that sense of powerlessness, is that it's not their actions that have put us here. It's been their parents and generations before. So I can imagine that there's a sense of anger and injustice there that is fueling this as well. And I guess from a sort of developmental perspective, that the age, that the age in those young teenage years are really a developmental phase where we know that anxiety typically first presents in kids. It's a very difficult, confusing time. So that narrative is just sort of, I guess, also amplifying what is going on with kids in a developmental sense as well.
Thanks, Fiona. And Melissa, if I can ask you, with your legal hat on, is this unusual for kids to be able to do this? I gather there might have been a guardian involved, or it just
it is relatively unusual for very young people to go to court, and there's a systems sort of technicalities of how that's arranged. But look, I don't think it's unusual for young people to take very hearty and sincere action when affected by things that they see are really really impacting on their lives and the lives of their future lives as well. And this is really the domain where youth and youthful enthusiasm is fantastic, because people will fight. And you see the climate extinction movement. You see people lobbying into electoral candidates or members of parliament and saying, I want to help your campaign because you're advocating for the things I believe in, or I'm going to act against a different politician who's acting in a way that's against my interests. I see young people involved at many, many levels. It's not just at the voting level, because it's not, you don't sort of, despite the law, you don't actually turn into a whole human at 18 years old. You actually sort of have a holistic growth process. And I see young people at quite young ages, even below teenagers, acting really sincerely and thoughtfully in their own environment, even in that very basic level of think globally but act locally. But yeah, look, Grant, not many young people go to court on these issues, but I think the court case is terrific and very interesting, but it's not the whole picture for me. I think there's so many different ways that young people can activate their advocacy. And one thing I will just give a big shout out for is, if anyone is just turned 18 in the last 3 years, or anyone that's just turned 18, get enrolled to vote right now, because we're about to have a federal election, and then in a few months we'll have a state election, and these things are important.
Thanks, Melissa. I'm going to turn to our top-rated Q&A question from Ronalyn Olenik, and she writes, I'm curious how the panel members take care of themselves and their mental health in light of our climate crisis. What can we do for ourselves when we feel so helpless? So I'll throw that to the panel members, and I've got a few thoughts Well, while you're thinking, I might just address that one a little bit. I mean, as a health professional who's been working in this area for a couple of decades, the emotional roller coaster you have from this is really quite profound. You know, you have high moments and you think, oh my gosh, we've got a carbon price. We've got a price of carbon. Oh no, we don't. You know, we've signed up to this agreement. Oh, but we haven't. And it just seems like it's been very up and down. I think if people are interested in this issue of sort of self-care, in the Medical Journal of Australia Insight, Professor Capon, who you heard from at the start, myself, have written a piece with a number of strategies that people can try to use, you know, problem-based approaches, emotion-based approaches, and meaning-based approaches, because this stuff runs pretty deep. So I won't try and get into all that and use up all that time, but I might throw to our panelists, and perhaps Fiona, if I could go to you first, if you're happy to comment on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I just want to note, I'm not a clinician, I'm a public health practitioner. So, you know, not the best person to recommend strategies, but I can speak from my personal experience. I've just lived through the floods here in Brisbane, and I was also impacted by the floods 10 years ago, and being immersed in this work and you know, having the media call me for comment after the floods was a moment for me where I actually realized I was at this point of being impacted, but also being called on to provide solutions and support, not just to my family, but in a role of responsibility to communities. And it is hard. It is just extremely difficult. And the only strategy that I shouldn't say the only one, but the most important strategy I've found for myself is to really stop and reflect on how I'm doing constantly, day to day, sometimes hour by hour, and act appropriately to that, which takes quite a bit of practice, and I'm certainly no expert at it, but I think I'm getting better. And to pull back, take time out, do all those self-care activities, whatever it is for you, whether it's meditation or mindfulness or a yoga session or a walk or whatever it is. Sometimes connecting with nature, I find, is a massive relief for me. So yeah, I think it's probably a combination of finding what your strategies are and also just being able to stop and reflect as a routine thing throughout days and weeks.
Thank you, Fiona. And Jane, I might go to you next.
Thank you. A really thought-provoking question. I think mental health is protected by maximising a sense of agency, so a capacity to influence our own lives, our relationships with the people near us, our contribution to the community. So for me, attempting to do what we can do on a domestic scale, perhaps clumsily, but in our notions of our local footprint and recycling, reducing our use of fossil fuels, that provides some modest sense of agency. But being an academic researcher is a highly privileged position. So the other sense of agency is ensuring that the research I do is informed by understanding the impact of people of what causes health inequality, so social and environmental determinants, but then making sure that the results are not just limited to academic journals. So as you know, I participate enthusiastically in the media, and probably one of the best things for me is I'm on radio every week for a short talkback program where we discuss matters of importance. This reaches hundreds of thousands of people. Any topic we raise, people talk about. And I feel that that can be a way of making a contribution that I wouldn't have if I wasn't in this position.
Thanks, Jane. And Melissa, if we can.
Look, I'll give you a very, very quick comment, Grant, and because the other two speakers have spoken really well about some of the things I would have raised. But I'll just say in thank you to the questioner who was concerned about our health and whether how we're going, because that was very kind of you. But look, my view on this is, as if you're an educator at a university like Monash, you must be optimistic. One wouldn't engage in education if you were a total pessimist, because what would be the point, right? We actually feel very empowered and enriched by communicating with young people and students at different levels all the time. And what we feel we do, and I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, is the ability to empower people with the knowledge, the skills, the literacy in their chosen discipline fields is incredibly helpful, because you see people transform over 6 weeks or 12 weeks into different people with different thoughts and different capacity to bring about change that they believe in. And this is really enriching for us as educators. So, you know, I add to what Jane and Fiona have said there, but I think that's where I get some comfort from.
Thanks a lot, Melissa. So as a good GP, I'm aware that our consultation is coming to an end, and I will aim to finish on time. A couple of closing comments. It's really been wonderful to hear from our panelists, and thank you for sharing your expertise so generously and your perspectives, and it's been very much appreciated. There's been quite a few links in the chat posted, which will be useful hopefully for our audience if they want to follow things up. It's been very enjoyable to work with Monash Sustainable Development Institute, and I want to particularly shout out to our organisers of today's webinar, Ronnie Maskell and Candice Lever, who've had a very professional approach, and thank you to Tony Capon also for hosting this. The video will be on the website. Apologies for the last couple of Q&As. There's some really thoughtful questions there, which we haven't had time to deal with today, but we wanted to thank everyone for making the time to be involved. Enjoy this World Health Day. It's a great time for reflection, and thanks again to our panelists.